She has no idea what she's doing. She never did. My father said that loudly enough for the entire room to hear. The mediation room at the law firm on Bay Street had those high ceilings that make every sound echo a little longer than it should. His voice bounced off the walls and landed somewhere in the center of my chest. I didn't flinch. I had been waiting for this moment for almost 3 years. And I had learned, somewhere along the way, that the best thing I could do was be completely, perfectly still. My name is Serena. I'm 31 years old. I own a structural engineering consultancy that has worked on 4 of the last 7 major bridge rehabilitation projects in Ontario. I hold 2 patents. I have 12 full-time employees and a waiting list of municipal clients stretching into 2028. My father does not know any of this. Or rather, he didn't. Not yet. That morning, he thought he was walking into a room to watch me fail. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters here. My father immigrated from Portugal with my mother when they were both in their late 20s. He built a construction company from nothing. Concrete forms, residential foundations, the unglamorous physical work that holds houses up. By the time I was in high school, Montero Builds had a decent reputation in the Kitchener-Waterloo region. Not large, not small. The kind of company that is always one bad contract away from collapse but never quite gets there. I grew up watching my father work. I respected it. I still do, actually, even after everything. He built something real with his hands and his stubbornness, and I understand that. What I do not understand, what I have never been able to understand, is why he decided so early that I was the wrong child. My brother, Andre, is 5 years older than me. He went into the business straight out of high school. No degree, no technical training. Just his last name and my father's hand on his shoulder. My father never questioned that choice. It was obvious, natural, the way water moves downhill. Andre would run Montero Builds one day. That was settled before Andre had ever poured a single foundation. I wanted to study engineering, structural specifically. I had been drawing bridge cross-sections in the margins of my notebook since I was 14. My father thought this was adorable the way adults think a child's interest in dinosaurs is adorable. Charming, temporary, something to be outgrown. When I got into the University of Waterloo's civil engineering program, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, without any particular cruelty, "What's the point? You'll just end up back here anyway." I did not end up back there. I graduated with honors. I did a master's at the University of Toronto. I worked 4 years at a mid-size firm in Mississauga, learning every corner of the trade. Then I started my own consultancy out of a second bedroom in my apartment in Guelph. I named it Bridgework Structural Inc., which my mother said sounded too plain, and my father said nothing about at all, because by then we spoke maybe 4 times a year. The distance between us had been growing since university, and by the time I was 27 it was basically a geography. We were polite at Christmas. We did not call each other. He had stopped asking about my work somewhere around 2022, which was a relief, because explaining what I did to him had always felt like explaining color to someone who had decided not to see it. The problem started with a contract. In the spring of 2 years ago, the region of Waterloo put out a request for proposals on a significant infrastructure project, the rehabilitation of 3 pedestrian bridges along the Iron Horse Trail. It was the kind of contract that would be good for any firm my size. My firm submitted a strong proposal. We got shortlisted. Montero Builds also submitted a proposal. My father had been trying to expand beyond residential foundations for years, and he had hired a project manager named Kevin who was supposed to help him pursue municipal work. This was Kevin's first big pitch. The problem was that Montero Builds was a construction company, not an engineering firm. To take on a rehabilitation project like this one, they needed an engineering partner to sign off on the structural assessments. Kevin called me. I want to be clear about this part because I have thought about it many times since. Kevin called me as a professional contact, not as the boss's daughter. He found Bridgework Structural through a referral from someone at the region. He did not know at first that I was connected to the company he was calling on behalf of. When he figured it out, mid-call, there was a pause that I still remember very clearly. Then he said, "Is this going to be a problem?" I told him it wasn't. because professionally it wasn't. I was capable of doing the work. I structured the arrangement carefully. A formal subcontract agreement, clear scope of work, payment terms tied to project milestones, and a clause that I had my lawyer draft specifically if Montero Builds defaulted on payment to Bridgeworks Structural at any point during the project. All engineering documents, drawings, and certifications would revert to my firm's sole ownership, and Montero Builds would lose the right to use them for any purpose, including completing the project. I did not do this because I expected trouble. I did it because I am an engineer, and engineers build redundancy into everything. My father found out I was the subcontractor about 2 weeks into the project. I know this because Andre called me irritated in that particular way he has, where his voice gets very flat, and said, "Dad knows you're on the contract. He's not happy about it." I asked Andre why. Andre said, "You know why?" And I did know why, vaguely. Something about appearances, about what it looked like to the region if his daughter was involved. Some story my father had told himself about nepotism that conveniently ignored that he had hired his own son to run his company. But I had a signed contract. The work was underway. There was nothing to do but finish it. And then Montero Build stopped paying. The first missed payment I attributed to administrative delay. Invoices get lost. Accounting departments get backed up. I sent a formal reminder. 2 weeks passed. I sent another. A month passed. I called Kevin. Kevin sounded uncomfortable. He said there were cash flow issues. He said my father was reassessing the partnership. I asked Kevin to clarify what reassessing meant in the context of a signed subcontract agreement. Kevin did not have a clear answer for that. What was actually happening, I learned later, was that my father had convinced himself that because I was his daughter, the payment terms were negotiable in a way that a contract with a stranger's company would not be. He had told Andre that I would understand. He had apparently told Kevin that family doesn't sue family, and that I would wait as long as needed. He had not told me any of this. By the time the third payment came and went without a transfer, I had consulted my lawyer. The contract was clean. The clause was enforceable. I sent a formal notice of default to Montero Builds' registered address, not to my father personally, not to the house I grew up in, but to the company's legal address, through proper channels, registered mail. My lawyer prepared the reversion documents. I waited the notice period. Montero Builds did not cure the default. The engineering documents reverted to Bridgeworks Structural. What this meant practically was that the project stalled. The region of Waterloo sent an inquiry. Montero Builds could not produce valid engineering certifications for work already completed because those certifications were now mine. The project was in jeopardy. My father, who had apparently not understood what the clause actually meant until this moment, called me for the first time in 8 months. He did not ask how I was. He said, "What do you think you're doing?" I told him I was enforcing a contract. He said I was embarrassing the family. I said I had invoices totaling $63,000 that had not been paid. He said I was doing this out of spite. He said I had always had a chip on my shoulder. He said I had been difficult since I was 17 years old, and that he had tried, he had genuinely tried, and that this lawsuit, this legal nonsense proved that I was exactly the kind of person he had always worried I would become. I let him finish. Then I told him my lawyer would be in touch. The formal mediation was my father's lawyer's idea. I think they believed that if they could get me in a room, they could pressure me into settling for a reduced amount or signing the engineering documents back over in exchange for some portion of what I was owed. My father's lawyer, a man named Doyle, who I gathered was semi-retired and largely unfamiliar with intellectual property clauses in subcontract agreements, had sent my lawyer a letter suggesting that the reversion clause was unconscionable and might not hold up. My lawyer, who is not semi-retired and is extremely familiar with such clauses, wrote back 2 sentences. My mother called me the week before the mediation. She was not calling to ask how I was either. She was calling to tell me that what I was doing was tearing the family apart, and that I needed to think about what mattered in life. I listened. I said I understood she was upset. I did not change anything. The morning of the mediation, I wore a navy blazer and flat shoes and drove myself to Toronto. I had a coffee from a place on Queen Street that I like and I sat in my car for 10 minutes before going in. I was not nervous. I want to be precise about this. I was not calm in a forced way, not performing calm. I was genuinely settled, the way you are when you know exactly what is in the room, and you built the room yourself. My father was already there when I arrived. He was standing with his back to me talking to Doyle in a lowered voice. Andre was there too, which surprised me. He had no legal role in the mediation. He was there, I realized, the way you bring someone to a difficult conversation when you need the emotional weight of their presence. My father thought having his son in the room would make me feel outnumbered. The mediator, a sharp woman named Carla who worked out of a firm on Bay Street, introduced herself and outlined the process. She was brisk and precise, and I liked her immediately. Doyle opened. He laid out Montero Builds' position. That the subcontract had been entered into under an assumption of family cooperation, that the payment delays were temporary and due to cash flow issues caused by an unexpected equipment repair, that the reversion clause had not been adequately explained to his client at the time of signing, and that the entire situation could be resolved if Serena, that's what he called me, not Ms. Montero, just Serena, as though he were a family friend, would agree to a payment plan of $30,000 over 18 months and return the engineering documents immediately. I did not look at my father during this. I looked at my hands, which were folded on the table in front of me. Then my father started talking. Doyle had not planned for this. I could see it in the way his pen stopped moving. My father stood up. Actually stood up from his chair, and began to speak directly to Carla as though she were a judge and he were making a closing argument. He said I had always been the difficult one. He said I had gone to university to prove something instead of because it made practical sense. He said I had never understood the construction business, that I had theories and drawings but no real-world sense. He said the consultancy I ran was, as far as he had seen, a marginal operation dependent on government contracts, and that I had no idea what it meant to run a real business through real hardship. He said I was doing this, the legal action, the document reversion, to humiliate him, and that I had always resented the fact that Andre was the one he'd brought into the business. He said, loudly, pointing his finger at the table, that I had no idea how things worked in the real world. Carla let him finish. She is a professional. Then she picked up a folder that her assistant had placed on the table and said, with a tone that was completely neutral, "Before we go further, I want to make sure everyone in this room has reviewed the financial disclosure documents that Ms. Montero's counsel submitted this morning." Doyle looked at the folder. He had not reviewed them yet. Carla said, "Bridgeworks Structural Inc. has current active contracts with the region of Waterloo, the City of Hamilton, and the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario. Their 2024 revenue was approximately $2.3 million. They hold 2 patents registered with the Canadian Intellectual Property Office." She paused. She looked at my father. She said, "Mr. Montero, you said your daughter has no idea how things work in the real world. I want to make sure you understand who you're in a room with." My father opened his mouth and then closed it. Andre, for the first time since I'd arrived, looked at me. Really looked at me. And I saw something move across his face that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't shame exactly. It was more like the moment when a picture that has been slightly crooked for so long you stop noticing it suddenly gets straightened. Doyle asked for a 10-minute break. During the break, I went to the washroom. I ran cold water over my wrists the way I do when I need to stay level. I looked at myself in the mirror. I thought about the second bedroom in my Guelph apartment where I had invoiced my first client on a second-hand laptop, and about the 4 years I had spent at that firm in Mississauga learning every piece of this trade so that when I finally built something it would be built right. I thought about the margins of my notebooks, all those bridge drawings I had done as a teenager, the girl who wanted to understand how things stayed up. I walked back into the room. Doyle made a revised offer. Full payment of $63,000 within 90 days, plus a modest amount for legal costs. He said Montero Builds would need to retain the right to use the engineering documents for the purposes of completing the Iron Horse Trail project, or they would be in breach of their municipal contract. My lawyer said that was workable, contingent on the payment being secured. I said there was one more condition. Everyone looked at me. I had been almost entirely silent for the past 2 hours, which I think had made them comfortable. People get comfortable when you're quiet. They start to think the silence means you don't have anything left. I said that as a condition of settling, I required a written acknowledgement from Montero Builds that Bridgework Structural Inc. had fulfilled all contractual obligations to a professional standard, and that the dispute had arisen solely from Montero Builds' failure to meet payment terms, not from any deficiency in the work. Doyle started to object. I said, calmly, that this was not a negotiation point. If the acknowledgement wasn't part of the settlement, we were going to court. And I was comfortable with that outcome. My contract was clean, my clause was enforceable, and the only question a judge would have to answer was how much Montero Builds owed me, not whether they owed me. There was a silence in that room that lasted probably 15 seconds and felt like a season. Doyle looked at my father. My father was looking at the table. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago, which is something I had not expected to feel complicated about. I thought it would feel clean. A simple satisfaction. It didn't. It felt like watching something collapse that had been leaning for a long time, and understanding that you didn't build the lean, but you were still watching it fall. Doyle said they would accept the condition. The settlement was signed that afternoon. $63,000, secured by a personal guarantee from my father on top of the corporate obligation, because Doyle's semi-retirement had apparently not covered the part of contract law where a mediator can push for that. The written acknowledgement was attached as a schedule. My lawyer got a copy to the region of Waterloo by end of day, which meant the project could resume without further disruption. My father did not look at me when we left the room. Andre caught up to me in the elevator lobby. Just the two of us, for a moment, the way it almost never is. He said, "I didn't know the numbers were like that." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "You should have told us." And I looked at him for a moment. My brother, who has my father's stubborn jaw and my mother's eyes, who has been standing next to our father his whole adult life, assuming I would always be the one standing outside. And I said, "You should have asked." The elevator came. I took it. He didn't. I drove back to Guelph on the 401 with the radio off. The sky was doing that October thing. It does in southern Ontario. That low gray light that turns everything into a photograph of itself. I thought about what it would mean going forward, whether there would be Christmas dinners, whether my mother would call, whether Andre would call. I didn't have answers to those questions, and I still don't really. That's the part no one shows you. The part after the room. The documents are signed and the obligation is clear and the principal has been settled, and then you still have to drive home through the gray October light and figure out what comes next. What I know is this. Bridgework Structural has a contract renewal meeting with the Ministry of Transportation in November. We are shortlisting 2 new engineers to hire in the new year. I am presenting at a conference in Vancouver in the spring on longspan pedestrian bridge retrofits, which is a niche I love with a specificity that still surprises people when I talk about it. My father built something from nothing with his hands and his stubbornness, and I have done the same thing, differently, in a language he never tried to learn. I don't know if that's a tragedy or just what time does to families. Probably both. Probably neither. Probably just the way things stay up if you build them right. I keep thinking about the moment my father's voice disappeared. Not the settlement, not the signed acknowledgement, not the $63,000. Just that moment, when the mediator read the numbers out loud and my father had nothing left to say. That silence told me more about how things actually work than almost anything else that happened in that room. What I've come to understand is that outcomes like that one don't arrive by accident. They arrive because of decisions made years earlier, in quiet, when no one is watching and no one is impressed. The reversion clause in that contract wasn't written out of anger. It was written because I had spent a decade learning my trade carefully enough to know what could go wrong and how to build against it. That's not luck. That's the slow, unglamorous work of actually knowing what you're doing. My father called my consultancy marginal. He said I had theories but no real-world sense. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to find out, was that the real world had been my classroom for years by then. I had just been studying a different curriculum than the one he recognized. I think about Andre in the elevator lobby saying I should have told them, and I understand the feeling behind that. Part of me wanted to, genuinely. There were moments over the years when I wanted my father to know what I had built, not to prove anything, just because it was real and it was mine and I had worked for it. But I had also learned, slowly, and at some cost, that the people who dismiss you before you have anything to show them will usually find a reason to dismiss the evidence too. The problem was never the evidence. The problem was the decision they had already made. I couldn't change that by announcing my revenue. The only thing that could change it was reality arriving in a room they couldn't leave. What I carry from this, honestly, is something about the relationship between integrity and patience. Not patience in the passive sense, not waiting and hoping. I mean the kind of patience that keeps building when nobody is watching, that honors its own standards even when the only person who will ever know is you. I invoiced correctly. I waited the notice period. I filed through proper channels. I could have called my father and threatened. I could have gone around the contract and made it personal. I didn't, because the work deserved better than that, and so did I. There's something my grandmother used to say. She was a practical woman, not given to speeches. That what you build in the dark is what holds when the light comes. I didn't fully understand it when I was young. I think I understand it when I was young. I think I understand it now. The folder Carla opened contained facts. Those facts existed because I had been doing the right thing, methodically for years, not for an audience, not for a moment like that one. Just because it was the right thing. The moment was only possible because of everything that came before it. All the quiet and the work and the decisions made without any guarantee of return. I drove home on the 401, and the sky was gray and low the way October gets in southern Ontario, and I thought about what it means to actually know who you are when the room goes quiet. That's the thing no one can take from you. Not a father who never asked. Not a brother who never looked. Not a lawyer who never did his homework. You know what you built. You know how you built it. And when someone finally opens the folder, the numbers are already there.